All right, welcome back from the break, folks. Now we're going to start talking about what databases are and what they mean, some of our reference sites, and then we'll dig into looking at MySQL Workbench and loading up a sample database so we can get our feet wet a little bit with the products. What we're going to do first is let's talk about what is a database. And the thing I do want to kind of point out is I have a couple of videos linked up here that I expect you guys are going out there and watching it. You can get somebody else's perspective on this. But we will use a few different websites here as kind of primary resources as we're working. Probably, I would say our most important site in terms of reference material will be W3 Schools. And these links are in our course shell, but I will drop them in the chat as we're kind of proceeding here. This is a page you probably want to bookmark. This is not, I would call it so much a tutorial site. That it has like a structured pathway as much as it is a reference site, although it has a lot of built-in little tutorials. So it has a complete language reference, and I'm kind of scrolling through the sidebar here. All the key commands, and then it has some reference materials, and then they have examples and whatnot. What I really like a lot about this site, and some of you are already quite aware of it, but as we start to learn syntax for code, they give us examples. And then typically what they do is they have these little try it yourself tools where you can actually code in the browser and play with their code on their sample data. And I would say that just in general, that the value of this site really is the fact that it's an excellent reference site for all the different languages you see across the top here. And MySQL is one of those languages that's listed here. So I would bookmark this site or that page or whatever. That's going to be an important one. Another one that's pretty important is this MySQL tutorial site. Once again, link in the chat, also linked up on our in our course shell, and I apologize for the ads. So this is another one of those sites that has great reference materials. I like to use it a lot. They have really good examples. The examples are well built out. Excellent explanations on even very advanced topics in this area, which is a little bit lacking over at the W3 school site, frankly. Very good reference. Bookmark this one as well. The other one that I was pointing out earlier too is this tutorials point. And once again, this is kind of similar to W3 schools, and they have a whole like MySQL homepage area. Once again, link in the chat. This is a really useful site. I like the way that they kind of put stuff together. I will have you notice that they like as they begin here, they're making this assumption a lot of people are coders. So they talk about how you administer, install the syntax to connect to a lot of popular frameworks and programming languages, and then how you connect and how to work with Workbench, which is all good. But then they also get into how you work with the actual databases. And you can see they have everything categorized here. And they go pretty deep as well. And I like the examples that they have here. And you can see this is very, very extensive. And I would say between these three sites, you can get most of the stuff that you need in terms of reference. We shouldn't ignore the main MySQL website. This is open source software, and it's free software. And a lot of people use it, right? And I think I've mentioned this already, that this is an Oracle product. It's the free version of the Oracle database. There is no cost to it. All of those features. And this is what we call the official website from Oracle for this technology. So you would imagine that, and whatever version you want to download, whatever documentation you're looking for or whatever, this is probably a good site to go to as well. I will be really frank, when I'm looking up issues with MySQL code, this is probably the last place I go. But I do find people that do like looking at their documentation. The one reason I told you not to install it is because it's all right here. right? So, and this is dynamic and it's changed. And then they have lots of resources for developers if you're doing very specific types of things, not to mention all the downloads and all the different versions that are available. Knowing the version of MySQL that you're running is important, especially when you're writing code for it, because when they switch major product versions, the language sometimes changes, and so do the commands. And the core parts of the SQL language really are, probably always be the same, but there's nuances. There are some significant differences between what we call the long-term stable support versions of the product. We are using, I would call it the latest stable version, which is version 8. But what I will tell you is out in the wild, and that means like out in production in the world, not everybody uses the latest version of server software for a lot of different reasons. So the preeminent reason is when you get a big complicated system up and running and it's working, you don't mess with it, right? You have a server environment that's stable and operating, and changing version numbers might blow the whole thing apart. You don't change it, right? So one thing that is potential that you might encounter out in the workplace is that you may have learned version 8, but version 6 or 7 is still being used in production wherever you're at. Chances are slim to none for that. Version 7 perhaps, but MySQL version numbers are kind of weird too. So like I'm speaking like I know right off the top of my head, but I think like on our web server, we went from version 5 to version 8 or something weird like that. Not every version number is a long-term support version. And don't quote me on the version numbers. Just know that we're using version 8, and that's what we're learning here. All right, let's now go back and just kind of take a look at some basic concepts here about databases. And what I'm going to do is I am going to go to W3 Schools here, and I'm going to go to their intro page, and I'm just going to read a couple little key sections here, and then we'll turn our attention back over to Workbench. When you look at this website here, and they talk about an intro to MySQL, and they say it's a very popular open source relational database management system. And it is, right? The system that they refer to is a combination of the server software and the software that sits on top, like Workbench or the command shell, that allows us to interface with that system. It's tools working together. It's not one singular tool. It's a collection of tools. Okay, so relational database system. And, I feel very compelled here to kind of do this like goofy little demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Google Drive, and I'm going to make a new, not a new folder, but a new spreadsheet. And why on earth do I start talking about spreadsheets? Why do I talk about spreadsheets when I talk about databases? Does anybody know why? Finley?
Most databases either utilize spreadsheets or almost consist of data formatted for spreadsheets.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to look at it. Um, when we look at a spreadsheet is basically a document that contains text, right? But the document is arranged in rows and columns. So like when I'm in a spreadsheet, you can see I have columns, and they're lettered, and then I have rows and they're numbered. And we call this, in the tech world, we call this tabular data, right? Rows and columns. And the reason we do this is because we can put information in any one of these boxes wherever we choose. So like if you're building structured data, so for example, if I was building a list of names, I call it first name, and then I have last name, and you guys are like, why is he putting an underscore in there? We'll explain that later, right? And then we start adding people's, first names here, like I'll put my name and my last name, and we have multiple entities. So Finley, I'm going to pick on you. because you're top left most on my screen actually is why, right? But just for as an example, so all of us would enter information in this fashion. Now, a spreadsheet, for anybody that's worked a spreadsheet before, a lot of people know that spreadsheets can have multiple tabs. So I can have multiple screens of rows and columns, right? And I can have, for example, another tab here with other information on it. And I mean, in principle, the information is related because they're part of the same spreadsheet. But in truth, if I put a piece of data here, it's not connected to any data here because aside from the fact that they're part of the same file. When we start working with a database does the same thing. It takes information and arranges it with a tabular structure. So in other words, rows and columns. Certain types of data will go into certain columns, and each individual entity that's represented in the database will have its own row that the data goes into. More importantly, I might have a table that might have, the information of, I don't know, let's say, demographic information, first name, last name, address, phone number, email address, that kind of thing. Then I have a separate table that might indicate your hours worked and wages or something of that nature. And if I was working in a database system, I would recognize that the one table where it indicates hours and wages is connected to the individual listed in the, I don't know, employee table. And there's a relationship between that table and the wages table. And when you start to look at a database that's really kind of a conglomeration of many tables and their connections and how they all work together, that's where we get to what we call a relational database system, right? There's reasons for doing this. So I'll give you a couple of, we'll get into all this deep when we get into the course. But if you can imagine, right, if I was building a database table, and let's say this first row here is going to be my column headers, and I'm just going to use some of my basic spreadsheet skills. So I might have like let's say, how about employee, or let's abbreviate here. We'll go employee ID, for example, and maybe my employee ID is 1001 and Finley's is 1002, for example. And then I might also have, I don't know, let's say a date of birth, email, and I don't know, phone numbers. People still use those, right? Phones. And then we can put in our, our information, right? Whatever that happens to be. And let's put in my gateway email address here. And how about a nonsense phone number? Something like that. All right. Now, if I wanted to connect my information here to information in a different table, so let's say this is a table of employees, right? And then this is a table of wages, right? And I might have different column headers here. So for example, I might have stuff like, I don't know, hours worked, for example, rate per hour. And notice I'm coming up with names here. And then, you know what, I probably also need to connect it up to the employee. So I probably want to use that employee ID somehow. And you guys see how I'm kind of like very quickly kind of putting information together. So like I would say that employee with that ID has worked, I don't know, 40 hours this week, and they get paid $1,234 per hour. That's their rate. I wish, right? That was my rate, because I wouldn't work very much then. But here's the interesting piece, right? So this is how a database works. A database would allow you to connect the information in this column to the information in this column. And that way, when I went to report wages here, I didn't also have to include the person's first name, last name, email, date of birth, and phone number, because that information would be superfluous and it would make the database inefficient to repeat the information, right? And this process of figuring out what information you do or do not repeat is a thing we're going to learn too. It's a process we call normalization, right? And this is one of the aspects of the things that we learn. So if you can wrap your head around the fact that a database in essence holds tabular data and collections of tabular data, right? And then the structure, the schema of the database uh, tells us what all the connections are and how they relate to each other. All right, so to kind of drive home this fact, I just want to let you guys know that as we kind of dig in here. Okay, so why do people use this? This has been around for a while. Real frankly, it is from Oracle Corporation, uh, as we mentioned. Who uses MySQL? Everybody on the internet does, for one thing, right? Or the Maria database, which is kind of a clone of it. So somewhere I heard an estimate that about 75% of the world's websites use PHP and MySQL as their back end. And when you think about that, MySQL databases drive most of the internet. That's really pretty impressive, right? And it's a technology we don't really hear a lot about. So, like, if you are a web developer, I think maybe a couple of you are, or maybe you guys are all data people. So, I teach my web students, for example, when we get to the later ends of the web program and we are working in content management systems like these, that the MySQL database is on the back end of the database. What's really fascinating is, for example, my students who are in the web program can access their MySQL databases through this tool called PHP which is a web-based database management system that connects to MySQL or Maria databases and allows my web students to interface with their databases without downloading any software, right? They just go to the web browser, they log in on their host platform, and they can get to their databases and look at the data inside or manipulate it or write queries. So this is a web-based tool, right? So web developers get to know this one pretty well. And this would be our alternate tool. If you guys got stuck and didn't have a computer that could do database work, I would hook you up with an account there, just so you know. But our goal here is really kind of look at Workbench today. So I'm going to bring that product up. I actually have it up and running here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out of the product just for the sake of demonstrating the initial launch screen. Now, I know we did this in the previous video, but when you bring up MySQL Workbench, you come here to the connection tiles. And we talked about this already. The default connection to your local instance is already pre-configured. And the first time you click on it, it will prompt you for the password. And then my recommendation, you're working locally, this is my thinking, you save that password. I don't want to type it each time. Plus, what information are you storing in it? Credit card numbers? No. You're doing like sample databases for this class, so there's no sensitive information of any sort. So to connect, then all you have to do is click that tile. If you need to create the connection, you can use this little plus mark, or you can always edit a connection and revise it. And you can see I have multiple ones here for different demonstration purposes. I'm going to go ahead and click the tile and connect. If you're prompted for your password, go ahead and connect to it. Now, as a quick little tour of the environment, this is not dissimilar from other tools of the same sort. So the reason I say this is the other product that's really popular in this sphere that does this type of work is a product called SQL Server Management Studio from Microsoft, which is designed to interface with Microsoft SQL Server databases. And it used to be not that long ago when we were teaching this class, that was actually our preferred product. And then about, I don't know, 3, 4 years ago, we decided to switch over to MySQL, and I'm happy that we did. Right. A couple of reasons. MySQL runs a lot more efficiently than SQL Server. So when students were installing it, it was a much lighter load on their machines. And frankly, from the web development standpoint, that's a way more popular product for web work than SQL Server is, unless you're in a Microsoft environment. And basically, the SQL language skills that you learn in either database technology are identical, basically, with little nuances, right? Potato kind of things. Um, Now, this type of tool usually you can compare this to an IDE for coding. Now, I assume that most of you have done some coding in the past, but if you haven't, because it is possible that you can just jump into this class because it has no prereqs. But if you've coded, for example, in Python or Java or HTML or some language like that, or C# or something, you usually work inside of an IDE. We call that an integrated development environment. And that, in essence, is what this product is, but it is designed for database work, right? And very specifically for MySQL. So most integrated development environments give you a collection of tools right within the piece of software to allow you to do pretty much everything you need to do without leaving the software to see if it works. Where in the old days, the way that we would do it is we'd go to a command line and type everything at the command line, and then you'd run the program and see what happens. Very different type of coding environment. So just a very quick tour of the environment here, and I'm going to kind of walk through the panels and then start doing some demos and load up a database. But we're basically broken up into several key panels, let's call them, inside the window. The primary panel is the big one in the top right, which is the coding window. This is where we will type our SQL code. And I'm going to zoom in here. For example, we would type commands like create database, and one of my favorites, whatever, and that's a SQL command. And we'll learn about the nuances of those, but basically you'll write a command and then you'll come up here and you'll click the lightning bolt, either the singular one, the first one on the left, which runs the whole file, or the particular command one. So often what we do when we do the homework in this class is we'll write all of our commands on one SQL script, but we'll execute each statement separately. And then in that case, you usually use this lightning bolt. So whichever statement you're currently on, with your cursor, that's the one that will execute, right? And generally, what happens, and I see I already have a database here named whatever, so I'm going to call this one whatever 2. And I'm going to go ahead and execute this command. So I'm going to use the singular execution command, and I'm going to run it. And then at the bottom here, and this is what we call our output window, it shows the result of the action. Notice the green check mark. That's good, by the way, right? That means it worked. And if it didn't work, that would be a red X, and you would have some sort of a message indicating that. Now, I created a database called whatever2, and it says 1 rows affected, tells me how long it took, and it told me that I was successful. Now, in my schema window here, and I want you to notice that this top left panel has 2 tabs, and yours probably opened up to admin, but there's a second portion of it, which is schemas. Schemas is a way to say the structure of all your databases, is kind of a nice way to say it. You'll notice that I created a database. It said it worked, but I don't see it. There's this little button up here that is a refresh, by the way. It doesn't tell you that it's a refresh. But you notice when I hit it, now my new database appeared here in the schema table. And so what this is telling you is all the stuff that's listed there in the sidebar on my machine are all databases that are already loaded on my system. You guys, since you've just installed it, you're probably only seeing the system database. So there's a host database that travels with the product. And what's inside there are all the settings for the product, by the way. Right. So once again, coding window, output window, and then here we have the admin panel, the schemas, and then we also have this like properties or information area down here. So relative to whatever object we'll click upon, let's say in one of our databases, we can get information about that object in this window. There are other panels that pop up. So, mine's undergone usage, but if I remember right, there were some panels here on the right that you can turn on and off, including some that have like coding snippets that you can drop in pre-built code into your environment. Generally speaking, I turn those off, but there are times where I will turn those on. I just find it to be kind of a waste of screen space personally, right? The other thing that I will do is when I'm writing code, I will typically zoom in. Like right now, I'm like pretty zoomed in because if I don't, if my code was like this, you guys wouldn't be able to read it, right? Especially in the videos or the screen share. To make it bigger or smaller, you can hold down the control key and use the scroll thing on your mouse, or hold down the control key and plus minus to make it bigger or smaller. I think most of you guys already know those little tricks, but I can never take that for granted. Now, in order to kind of demonstrate how a database works, it's kind of helpful to load up a database. And I have a couple that I've shared. And let me just jump into the course, and then I'm just going to kind of talk about why or why not to use certain ones. And you'll notice at the very bottom of unit 1, I do have the Sequila database, and there's a couple extra steps to working with this one. So I should actually probably hide this from you guys right now. So I just hit it so you guys can't see it anymore. But if you come over here to the course resources page, I do want to point out a few things, right? So I have some links to some of the sites I talked about. I also have a few different databases already sitting here, including the Sequila database that I told you not to mess with for right now. And then the PowerPoint slides from our old textbook, which are out there for the taking if you're interested, and all the student files that came with that book. Once again, we're not using that book anymore, but you might find some of the files and examples useful. So they're there, and they're not proprietary. All right, and Martin, I see that you dropped a question in there, the differences between a database and a schema. I think about it's a very good question because in essence they're kind of the same thing, but a schema is really the structure of a database and the hierarchy of a database, where the database is the entire construct, is the way that I would look at it. It's a collection. It's kind of like you think of the schema as like the framework for the database, right? In that schema window, we can look through those entire frameworks, right? Not just singular pieces of data, but good question. All right. So ultimately, my point is that we will work with this particular file. So you can download it here from the resources page, but I also want to show you that it's available on one of our web servers here on campus. So you can pull it down right from this link. So if you go to Unit 1, go to the videos, I have a link to it right there. You might find that easier. I'm just pointing that out. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click on that link, and I want to show you what happens when you click on it. So I'm going to click on it. Oh, of course, yeah, I'm in instructor mode, so I don't get to just click on a link and go. All right. And what happened is it downloaded that SQL file to my downloads folder. And you can see it's in there. And apparently the first click did work. So I'm going to go to that file now that I've downloaded. So whether you grabbed it from resources or you grabbed it from that web link, either one is fine. It's the same file. But this is a file, and I want you to notice has a .sql extension. Now, for some of you, you might not be seeing those files extensions, and we talked about this last week, right? And what I suggested is that you don't hide your file extension so it looks like that, that you unhide them so it looks like this, so you can see that it's a SQL file. You'll also notice that this is already attributed to a piece of software, probably that I don't want to open it with. But for right now, I'm just going to open this up in a plain text editor because I just want to show you what's inside of it before we bring it in to MySQL Workbench. So here's a file, and it is plain text. There's no rich text in here. There's no bold or italics or colors. And the color coding that you're seeing here is being done by my text editor because it's recognizing this as SQL code or database code, and it's highlighting the syntax. It's not colored text, right? And most of you who code get this concept already. What's interesting about this SQL file is it is what we call a script file, right? And so this is a little bit different than when like we write a computer program in Python, for example, where Python is a set of commands and then they execute. This is a script that operates, not only creates a database, it attaches to it, it creates the structure or the schema or all the tables and populates all the tables with information with this one script. Normally, each one of these statements, so I'm like highlighting a statement right now, are usually statements you would execute one at a time as a database administrator. A SQL script file such as this, I want you can kind of read some of the syntax here. So it says drop the database if it exists. So in other words, if you already installed this one, it's going to get rid of it. And then it's going to recreate it. And then it's going to attach to it. That's what the first three commands do. We'll learn the nuances of these commands later. Then we go through the process of creating all the tables or tabular data in the database, the column names, the data types, etc. You can see a bunch of tables are being created. And then we start inserting information into each one of the tables. So these commands here with the insert intos are the commands that drop all the data in. So this one singular file, when I import it into MySQL Workbench and hit the regular lightning bolt, it will execute all of these commands, and then I will have that database on my database server. So this is what I'm going to have you guys do. So download that SQL file. Leaving it in your downloads folder is absolutely fine. That's a fine place to leave it, right? Inside MySQL Workbench, and I want you guys to notice, I already have that database here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to issue the command to erase it in advance. So I'm going to say drop database, and it's my guitar shop. Notice how it auto completes as well. And then I'm going to execute the command, and you'll notice right away it disappeared on my schema. Okay. So then I'm going to clear this command out, right? Start with the blank slate. And now we're going to go through the process of importing that SQL file into this program and then executing it. So here goes. A couple different ways you can open it. You can go to the file menu and you can open a SQL script. That's one way, or you can come here to the menu bar, same thing. It's a second icon. Right. I'm going to go ahead and locate that in my downloads folder. And see, I downloaded it twice. I just grab one of them. It doesn't matter which one. So we're opening it. And then you can see that same file we were just looking at in the text editor is now here inside of my product. The other thing that you'll notice is this code was written by somebody who knows what they're doing, right? And it's all error free. There's no red highlights or warnings or anything of that nature. When I come up here and I hit this lightning bolt, and I'm going to do it in a second, not quite yet. That, remember, the one on the left, right, will execute all the commands in the script file. The one on the right will execute only the one I've got my cursor on. Right. And that's a very important distinction Most of the time we'll use this one because we'll do one command at a time. But right now we want the whole file to run. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hit this one. Yeah. And it says execute the selected portion. Don't want to select anything, right? I just wanted to execute the whole thing. So we're going to hit the run button. And then you'll notice down here in the console, right, or the output window, all the commands and their results. So it went through all the commands in the script file and showed me what happened. Now, I am noticing that all of them are green except for three, and the ones that aren't green are yellow, right? And then that's technically, I would call that a warning, I think is what yeah, warning. Um, and so for example, for the command drop database if exists, well, you guys saw me do that manually before. So it's giving me a warning saying can't drop a database that isn't there, is basically what it's saying, right? This one says integer displays deprecated will be removed. Okay, so they don't like one of the commands in there. So they're saying one of the commands is deprecated. That means old, right? By the way, you should probably change it. And then right here, it says, it's trying to make a user account, but that user already exists, so it's not doing it. That's fine. Right. So this is a good result. If I had red X's, I'd want to pay very careful attention to them. Now, normally you wouldn't execute a full script file like this. We're doing this to load up the sample database. Now that it's in principle loaded, you still may or may not see it over here in the sidebar. So hit that little refresh, and now you should see it pop up. Now, unfortunately, I can't really zoom in on these little panels, but I'm going to use these little expander arrows here next to the guitar shop, and I want you to see what's inside this database. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm clicking on the title, right? And then I see a few different subcategories here. Tables, that's got content because of the little arrow. There's views, stored procedures, and functions. And we'll learn about all of these things, but these don't have the arrow, so that means there's none of those in there. But tables does, so I'm going to expand tables. And then with tables, you'll notice that there's looks like 6 or 7 tables here. So I have a table for addresses, administrators, categories, customers, order items, orders, and products. And I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on the first one, right? And then you'll notice a few different things are happening here as I start clicking about. The first thing is that bottom left panel, I've highlighted the table called addresses, and I actually clicked on it. And then down here in the info area, it's giving me a list of all the different columns and their data types and their sizes and whether or not they're primary keys or not. Right. And so this panel is giving me information about that selected object. All right. You'll also notice that right here next to each table and really any of the objects inside of here are these little micro icons, right? So one's a info, right? So I can pull up info about it, and it tells you how much information is in there, how many records there are. And you'll notice, man, tons and tons of information right here, right? I'm going to go ahead and close that, by the way. And then you have this little widget here. And I don't know what they call that widget. Is that just like the settings for it? And so you can come in here and tweak it through this graphical tool. So you can change the table name, change the other settings. Typically, you would not mess with this much, right? And usually you're writing this with code, but if you don't want to write it with code, there's certain actions that you can take graphically and not have to write the code. But our focus in this class is the code, just so you guys are aware. The other useful thing here that you'll probably use a lot is there's this third icon, which looks like a little table. And if you click that, well, guess what? It runs a snippet of code, and you guys can kind of take a look at that. That's a really basic select statement. And then it shows you the content of the table. That's the entire content of the table, right? I think it's kind of interesting though, because when I click this, instead of like it just automatically dumping the table, it shows you a command it's typing to get the table. And these are some of the commands we are going to start with, folks. So some of the commands we'll start with are the select statement. Star is a wild card, so it select everything from this database and that table. We're not qualifying any of the information. Let's see all of it. And then as you look at the information and it comes up in a tabular view, right, in a view that looks like a spreadsheet, right, you'll notice that unlike a spreadsheet, the column titles aren't like ABCD. They're actually the name of the column in the database. And then there's no row numbers here, but we do have both an address ID and a customer ID, and then all the data. Notice like we're looking at an address table, but it doesn't have any people's names in it. Where are the names? Well, the names are somewhere else. The names are in the customers table, right? So here's the people. And then notice that the customers have an ID, right? And what do you have? Email address, password, hashed, of course, first, last name, and then they have some other codes. We don't know what those mean. But when I look here at customer ID 1, that refers to this customer. But so does this one. So this customer's got 2 shipping addresses. You see how that is? Right. So that's kind of thing that it kind of gives you the capability for. But this is a way that allows you to just very simply look at the raw information that's in the database. And often, and especially if you guys are data people, right? And I think most of you are, or maybe your electives on this. When you have access to information, one of the things you always owe it to yourself to do is just, can I look at the information? In its raw form. I want to see what it actually looks like. Now, we're working with databases, real frankly, that are small in this class. You can see like my customer database has got 8 entries. But what if I had 8 million entries and I did the same command, select all of them and put them on the screen? How long do you think I'm going to be waiting for 8 million records to pop up? Right? So that's why we don't use databases of that size. But that is the type of thing that does happen in the real world, and why, and I want you to think about this. Every time you go out to the internet and do a search, where are those search results coming from? You think that Google just starts looking for that stuff when you asked? No, it's not how it works. They crawl the internet. They search the whole internet, follow every link that's on the public surface of the internet. And then every time they hit a new page, they put it in their database, and then they figure out what's on that page. And they put that in their database. So next time you come in and you're looking for something that's contained on that page and you do your search, it's pulling that result from a database. Can you imagine the size of that database? That's mind-boggling, right? How big is the searchable internet? Here's the even more mind-boggling part of it. 95% of the internet is not searchable. How do you like that? We can only search what we call the surface web, right? Why? For example, when you come to Gateway, you sign in to your class here on Brightspace. If I went to the Brightspace sign-in page, where if there is such a thing, that's one screen. Once I get signed in, well, then I see all my courses and all the pages and all the content. It's a tip of the iceberg effect, and that's how the internet is. So when you start thinking about the complexity of all the information on the planet and how much data is being generated, and that most of that data is being stored in databases out on servers in the cloud, it starts to hurt your brain a little bit as to how much information we're really talking about. It is humongous, right? Organizing it and finding efficient ways to organizing it and connect it together is what it's all about. And databases and tabular data in relational database systems is how we connect the modern world together. And without databases, we would be in a lot of trouble. Where would we put our information? It's kind of like having a business without a file cabinet. There's nowhere to put stuff. So how do you find your bills? That kind of thing. All right. So these are some of the basic ideas here. And what's kind of fascinating is like any of these spots here where we have these expanding arrows, right? You can dig in and look at the information that's here. So you can see like the structure of the database. You can see that every one of our database tables, and I think we did it like this, right? Maybe it was the second one here, where they start talking about the data types. We're going to look at like the different types of data. So the correlations to regular programming. If and maybe I should ask, is there anybody here who's never coded like in a traditional programming language like Python or Java or something like that? Okay, you guys are all good, thankfully. But okay, and if you haven't, right, I'm just trying to make correlations here. Um, you know, when we work with information, either in a programming language or a database, we have to organize our information into categories, right? And so we'll start learning about this as well. So, for example, this data type on this column is an integer. That's in SQL, they just say int. What's an integer? An integer is a counting number, like what you learn as a kid: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Not fractions, not decimal numbers, a counting number. And then another thing that goes into databases often are what we call text, right? And you notice here we have these things like, and they're all like called varchar, and they have a number after them. And that's generally variable characters, any text characters of any sort, up to 60 characters will fit in that field. That's what that means. Now, the correlation to regular programming is this. When we learn how to code, especially in a traditional language, and I'll use like Java or C# as an example, we'll create these constructs called variables, which are basically empty memory positions on the computer system. And those in a traditional language will be specified to hold only certain types of things. So, for example, if I develop an integer variable in Java, I can only put a counting number in it. I can't store words in it. Or if I set up a string data type in a language like that, I can't store numbers in it, that type of thing. Now, in a database, this is called referential integrity. So in other words, if I set up a column to be of a certain data type, I can only put that data type in. Otherwise, you start getting the red X's down here and stuff doesn't work. So here's the correlation and the connection between programming and databases, right? And maybe this will be eye-opening for many of you. When you learn how to write traditional computer code, you're often putting stuff into certain data types, because often when you're taking that code and you're storing the information from that application you just wrote, you're going to store it in a database. And the database, unlike Python, for example, is highly particular about the data type going into a field. It'll break the database if you don't put the right kind of stuff in it. So, for example, like I wouldn't put a gallon of milk in a paper bag. Is kind of a good correlation, right? Eventually it's going to soak through and be a disaster. So often when we write regular code or computer software, the reason we're particular about our data types is because often that information gets stored in the database, which is even more particular about the data type. So data types are very, very important in database work. So when you create a data type, you have to choose very, very carefully what data type you're choosing for a reason. I'll give you a great example. a lot of times, and you've probably encountered this, right? Um, if you were to create a data type for a phone number, what data type would you choose? I know what most of my students will say automatically. We'll say an integer, duh. And then if you start to think about it, and if you know what that is, you know what I'm talking about. And you start to think about it, and like, wait a second, but what if there's like dashes and parentheses and somebody types those in? Or have you ever filled out a form online where it says put in your phone number and you type in the dashes and it says must be a number? And you're like, huh? Right? Yeah. See, I would choose a text for a phone number, not a number. Right. And we go into like, data type philosophies and stuff here. But these are some of the basic constructs of what we're going to be working with. And so one of the things that we'll begin by learning is how to do some of the basic statements and how to build some basic tables. Um, we will use sample databases to begin with, and then we will construct our own. And then we'll learn how to manipulate data and do all sorts of fancy things, and we'll build up our skills. The thing that I'm really excited for you guys is, if you're brand new to learning databases, when you see what a database can do and how it can interface with your applications, it gives you all sorts of ideas for higher level capabilities in what you're doing. Databases are the preeminent ways that we store the world's data, and there's a reason for that. The concepts that we're learning actually go way back, and whoever like was the conceptual genius behind like developing all this stuff, I'm very impressed. That they thought about it so long ago and we use it so casually now. And and I know I've mentioned this, but like database skills are so in demand. Like even knowing a little bit of databases can sometimes get you employed as a database person, because very few people want to do it, real frankly. But those who do know how to do it, um, very, very high demand, and high levels of employability, especially if your skills get pretty advanced. If you are a web developer, so some of my students are web developers. Web developers typically will build a database. It'll usually be a pretty simple one, and they connect it up to a website and it works, and they forget about it. It's kind of like that. People who write full-blown applications often work with database administrators who build the databases, give them the connection codes and keys and everything, and then they just connect to it. In the data world, or in the AI world, a lot of the data that we work with gets so huge that it has to be in a database to retrieve it. And often, what we're mostly doing with databases is not necessarily building them, but extracting the right data from them in order to process it, either to do, analysis, forecasting, building machine learning models, or what have you, that type of thing. So the skill is a critical one. If this is something that really interests you as a profession, you can follow this pathway, and it can be a very lucrative one. Otherwise, I would say that in any aspect of IT, knowing a lot about databases and how they operate really empowers you and gives you a lot of value within any organization that you're operating in. So, very important skills. For now, what I want you guys to do is to try to get done the tasks in Unit 1, which is predominantly getting everything installed. What I will be doing is I'll be releasing Unit 2 shortly, and I'm just giving you guys a little bit of a preview here, but we're going to work on some of the more basic statements. We're going to do that hands-on together in class next week. But what I do want you to do is to make sure that you watch some of these videos and read up on some of the content. So I'm going to be sharing a series of links in here. That's why it's not released yet. So within the next day or two, I'll have this published. But this particular video, and I just want you to notice here, this comes up on LinkedIn Learning. And I know that especially in my data courses, we use a lot of the materials pretty heavily. LinkedIn Learning is attached to LinkedIn, which is like a, professional social network. They have a video, course department. If you guys aren't aware of that, all Gateway students get free access to this. So if you're clicking that link and you go to login screens, log in with your student email account, by the way, and then you will get full access to everything on this platform. And what I'll tell you about this platform is it's very, very cool. They got, like, if it's technology or screen related, you can find a course on it, not a video, a whole course. We have you linked up here to um, basically this whole course, and this link takes you right to the select statement. But what I might suggest for many of you, uh, in lieu of not having a textbook, you might want to go into this video series. Just go to the beginning and just, like, scroll through and just watch the videos. They go quick. You can even speed them up if they don't go quick enough. And then when you get down to the select statements, and I'm not really sure where that one was. I lost the link here. Whatever. Watch those videos and the ones that I recommend. I think if I remember right, the select and where clauses, and we'll spend a lot of time on those next week. But if you do a little bit of, like, pre-study on it, that would be very helpful. The other thing that I would look at would be here on W3 Schools to read, probably up through here, up through limit. Some of these we won't cover next week, but we will within the next couple of weeks. But get reading on these and start trying. And then next week, we will do a lot of hands-on in class. And the attempt here, by the way, is the way we're going to do it is we'll lecture and then we'll code together some, working on the homework. And sometimes we'll get through it, sometimes we won't. And whatever we don't get through, we'll cover the following week. Right. But everything will pretty much be guided here because, I anticipate that most of you are brand new. And that way, as we're doing it together in class, this is the other aspect of it. You can ask questions when things go wrong rather than going off and doing it on your own and waiting a week to see what the response is. So that's kind of my approach to it. Folks, this video will end here.